Covered in blood and dirt, I could only think how much I hated my mother-in-law, Rachel, who laughed as she pointed at my head. I had collapsed from heat stroke while cleaning the yard under her orders, hitting my head on a garden rock. Blood oozed from the wound, sticking to my palms, and I felt dizzy and nauseous. Driving or even walking was out of the question, so I called an ambulance. When Rachel saw the call history, she laughed. "Did you call an ambulance for that? Young people these days are such a hassle. It's because of idiots like you that those who really need it suffer. You should have gone yourself." She dragged me by the arm, forced me to stand, and shoved me into her car. Although furious with Rachel for calling me dirty, I was grudgingly grateful she was taking me to the hospital. I thanked her reluctantly. "Thank you for dragging me around, injured." "It's fine. You're supposed to go to the hospital by yourself." She laughed as she steered the car. However, she turned in a direction away from the hospital. "Wait, where are we going?" I asked. "I'm Cynthia, 28 years old, and I work as an office clerk from Monday to Friday." One evening, while watching TV, my mobile phone rang. It was Keela, a friend who moved here with me from our hometown. "Cynthia, are you free after work next Friday?" Kayla asked. "We often went out once or twice a month. There's a dinner party. Want to come?" I had no particular plan, so I agreed. At the dinner party, I met my husband Walter, who was 4 years older than me. We both loved traveling and hit it off while sharing travel stories, exchanging contact information. From then on, Walter and I called and texted every day and started hanging out on our days off. Time with Walter was always fun, and we quickly grew closer. About 6 months later, we started dating. After 2 years together, we got married. Soon after our marriage, Walter was transferred, and I quit my job to become a housewife. Given Walter's job at a big corporation, future transfers were expected. We began looking for a new place to move when Rachel, my mother-in-law, called. "Cynthia, do you have a moment?" she asked. "Yes, I do," I replied. "I heard you're moving here. Would you consider living with us? It's tough for me to support Theo alone, and it would be reassuring to have you with us." Initially, we had declined since father-in-law Theo's injury wasn't serious, but knowing Theo's kind nature, we worried and decided to move in. My in-laws' house was so large it could have been a guest house. We wouldn't have to worry about space. I had met Theo several times while dating Walter, and we bonded over our love for sweets. About a month after moving in, Theo's injury was healing, but he dropped a heavy object on his leg, causing a fracture. He needed surgery and had to be hospitalized for about 6 months. After completing the hospital admission process and bringing him clothes, I returned home to find Rachel at the entrance. "Rachel, I'm back. I'll start preparing dinner right away," I said, smiling. But she glared at me. "How long is this paperwork going to take?" "Your slowness is maddening," she said coldly. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had happened. "How long are you going to just stand there? Get moving and start making dinner," she barked. Rushed by her words, I hurried to the kitchen. From the day Theo was hospitalized, Rachel, who had been kind until then, transformed completely. I thought she was just in a bad mood, but from that day on, she began to harass me behind Walter's back. When Theo was home, Rachel would prepare breakfast, while I was in charge of lunch and dinner. Now I was responsible for cooking all 3 meals and managing all the household chores. Rachel, on the other hand, stopped doing any housework, spending her time watching TV or sleeping in. When she was awake, she complained about the food being too salty or the cleaning being sloppy. Cleaning a large house took a considerable amount of time, but the hardest part was managing the garden and the field. Given the rural setting, both were large and weeding was a constant struggle. Previously, a service had been hired for maintenance, but now I was managing it alone. If even a little weed was left, Rachel would scold me. At first, I endured it, but fearing I wouldn't have time for children if this continued, I consulted Walter. Walter believed me and warned Rachel, "Not even reflecting on your own insufficient work, and you enlist Walter on your side? If Cynthia could just manage the housework more efficiently, this would all be resolved. Do you really want to paint me as the villain? Honestly, what a heartless daughter-in-law I've ended up with," she sneered. Her verbal abuse only escalated from there. No matter what I said, it didn't get through to Rachel, so we decided to move. However, we missed the early spring moving season, leaving almost no apartments available. Those that were available were too far from Walter's workplace, so we decided to move into a new apartment that was soon to be completed and open for applications. The season changed to summer. Woken by the lively chirping of cicadas, I prepared breakfast for Rachel and Walter. After seeing Walter off, I tried to return to my room, but Rachel blocked my path, throwing sarcastic remarks and complaining about the breakfast taste or how sloppy the dishes were washed. Every day, I faced these criticisms, and as I hung my head, I heard a car engine outside. Thinking Walter had gone to work, I was suddenly shoved by Rachel, falling outside the entrance and landing on my backside. Rachel threw a garbage bag at me. "Today, you're cleaning the garden and the field. Don't even think about coming back inside until you're done." She laughed as she closed and locked the door. No matter how much I knocked, there was no sign of the door unlocking. Heading towards the back door, I found it locked as well, and a complete round of the house revealed all windows were locked too. Since I was at the entrance seeing Walter off, I didn't have my wallet or mobile phone with me. Feeling helpless, I heard Rachel's laughter from behind. "Still standing there. Get to cleaning. If you work hard enough, maybe I'll consider giving you some water." Rachel mocked me from the living room window. As I rushed over, she closed and locked both the window and the door, laughing spitefully. Left with no choice, I began pulling weeds amidst the cicadas chirping. After a while, I saw Rachel leave the living room. Moving to a spot out of her view, I started contemplating my next steps. Staying out in the harsh heat could lead to heat stroke. I thought about asking someone for help, but the neighbors would either be at work or out in the fields. Considering the risk of walking to the fields under the sun, I decided to hide in the shade until Rachel came to check. But Rachel showed no signs of coming out, and soon the sun was directly overhead, with no shade left. The midsummer sun mercilessly scorched my skin. I knocked on the living room window where Rachel was watching a drama. Looking annoyed, she opened the window and said, "What's this? You've spent 3 hours and only managed this much." She glared at the garden. In the midst of this unbearable heat, I begged desperately for water and a hat, but Rachel just laughed mockingly. "Then just pull out that big weed over there by the garden stone. After that, I'll give you some water." My throat parched, I squatted near the garden stone, trying to endure the nausea. However, my body had reached its limit. Instead of squatting, I collapsed towards the garden stone. Touching my instantly aching head, I saw blood from where I must have hit it on the stone. At that moment, I heard Rachel's scream. Rushing over hastily, she saw my blood and backed away. "We're going to the hospital. Grab your insurance card and come to the car," she yelled before hurrying back to the entrance. I entered the living room, grabbed my wallet and mobile phone, and called an ambulance. I was finally relieved to hear they would arrive quickly. Moving to the parking lot was impossible as my consciousness began to fade. I crawled onto the cold flooring, feeling a chill over my entire body. I took deep breaths until suddenly I was pulled by the arm. "I won't allow you to die here. We need to get to the hospital quickly," Rachel said, pulling my arm and forcing me to walk to the parking lot. Despite my nausea and desire to wait for the ambulance, Rachel wouldn't listen. She forcefully pushed me into the back seat and started driving roughly. Holding onto my mobile phone, I noticed the scenery outside the window was wrong. We were not heading towards the town with the hospital, but into the countryside, dense with fields and paddies. Minutes later, Rachel stopped the car and dragged me out, surrounded by fields with no one around due to lunchtime. Rachel's ugly smile grew as she forcibly took my tightly gripped mobile phone. Young people these days call an ambulance for a little blood. Have you ever thought about what the neighbors will say if they see an ambulance in front of the house? Nowadays, idiots call ambulances for ridiculous reasons, putting those who really need help at inconvenience. Such a foolish daughter-in-law needs to be disciplined. "Walk to the hospital and don't be so spoiled," she said, taking my mobile phone and putting it in her pocket. She dragged me, nearly powerless, towards the fields, with only the rice paddies below and no one in sight. "Please stop," I begged. Despite my desperate pleas, Rachel only laughed with a nasty smile. Saying nothing, she pushed me with all her might. I fell, pain surging through me from the impact. Satisfied with my moans, Rachel laughed and got back into the car without looking back. "Wait, please wait," I cried, holding my aching head, but all that receded was the sound of the engine as Rachel left me in the fields and drove away. I closed my eyes to escape the piercing sunlight. Without a mobile phone to call for help, and no ambulance expected to come to such a remote place. I felt hopeless. Being in a field below the road level meant no one could see me. The thought of possibly dying was my last before consciousness turned black. My eyelids fluttered open, bringing a white ceiling into view. Looking around, I saw the clean bed and realized I was in a hospital. Walter. I spoke to Walter, who sat beside the bed holding my hand and laying face down. Walter quickly lifted his head. "Cynthia, I'm so glad you're awake." He hugged me, tears in his eyes. He had stayed by my side the whole time I was unconscious. Confused, Walter explained why I was there. I hadn't died but had fainted from heat stroke. Luckily, the owner of the paddy field, who had come back early for lunch, found me. They called an ambulance in a panic. I was in a dangerous condition and was taken to a nearby large hospital where my life was saved. Hearing the hospital's name, I realized it was where Theo was hospitalized. Theo had come to check on me several times, worried, so I thought I'd thank him later. Then my thoughts turned to Rachel. "Walter, what about her?" Walter gripped my hand tightly and began to speak with a stern face. Rachel, seemingly unaware of anything, had returned home and tried to send the ambulance away, claiming she knew nothing when it arrived. Suspicious, the emergency services personnel were inquiring if Rachel might be the perpetrator of a prank call when suddenly the door opened. "Mom, what happened? Why is there an ambulance parked at our house?" It was Walter who had rushed in. He was supposed to have the day off but had gone to work due to an unavoidable task and had returned home as planned in the early afternoon. The emergency services explained that they had come to the house in response to a call about someone with heat stroke symptoms and bleeding from the head. But since I, the caller, was nowhere to be found, they were speaking with Rachel. Surprised by their ominous tone, Walter immediately called my phone. At that moment, Rachel, sweating and smiling nervously, grabbed Walter's arm. "I remember now, shopping. I said I was going out for lunch supplies, so she should be back soon, right?" Walter was not the only one who felt suspicious. "Sir, please call your wife," said one of the emergency services personnel. "Didn't you hear? She said she'd be back soon." As soon as the emergency services person said that, Rachel lunged at them, confronting the man aggressively. Meanwhile, Walter dialed my mobile phone. The ringtone from my phone could be heard coming from Rachel's pocket. "This is my ringtone." I had Cynthia listen and set the same tone. What a coincidence that I'm getting a call at this very moment. "Mom, show me your phone." Walter pressed Rachel, who was rapidly making excuses. Frustrated by Rachel's act of ignorance, Walter forcibly reached into her pocket and pulled my mobile phone out. He glared at her. Rachel let out a small scream and ran up to the second floor as if fleeing from Walter. Chasing immediately, Rachel slipped just before reaching the top of the stairs and tumbled down, her legs bending in clearly unnatural directions. Ultimately, Rachel, crying from the pain in her legs, was too preoccupied to speak about me. The emergency services said they would contact the police to start a search, and Walter readily agreed. Unable to leave Rachel in that state, they reluctantly took her to the hospital by car. Upon arriving at the hospital, Walter found me by chance. If I hadn't been at the hospital, they were planning to contact me after I woke up to hear what happened. But finding me by chance, Walter left Rachel to the doctors and stayed by my side the entire time. "Cynthia, I'm sorry. I never thought Mom could do something like this. She's mean, but not violent, not like this. I'm really sorry for putting you in danger. I'm just glad you're alive." Walter apologized with tears streaming down his face. Fortunately, the cut on my head wasn't serious, and the bleeding had stopped by the time I was brought to the hospital. The heat stroke was more severe, and I was still on an IV, but it was nearly finished. If there were no dizziness or other symptoms, I could go home. Thinking about returning to that house made me feel heavy. Then I wondered what had become of Rachel since coming to the hospital. "It's not your fault, Walter, but I can't live with her anymore." "What happened to her?" I asked while stroking Walter's crying back. Walter, looking slightly uncomfortable, replied, "Actually, she's in the room next door due to bed availability." Rachel was currently next door. I could feel my heart racing, considering what might have happened if I hadn't been found. The thought made me shiver with fear and anger. Mom broke both her legs and will be hospitalized for a while. "She's definitely being punished," Walter said with a grim face. I couldn't stay silent. "Walter, I'm going to Rachel's room now," I said as I got out of bed, stable on my feet. Walter accompanied me to the next room. The room was empty except for Rachel. I walked up to her bed and said, "What a terrible sight. Do you understand a little now why someone might want to call an ambulance?" I glared at her. Upon seeing me, Rachel spat out, "You look well enough. It must have been all an act," and refused to even make eye contact. Unable to contain my anger, I retorted, "I'm only well because an ambulance was called right after. If not, I might not be here today. Meeting you now, I see you have no remorse for what you've done. I will sue you. Be prepared." Rachel hurled insults, calling me a failure of a daughter-in-law, and screamed, "I won't allow you to sue me." But I ignored her and left the room. I was discharged the next day. I immediately went to view a new apartment I had applied for and decided to move in the same day. We packed our things without any rush and moved out of Rachel's house. In the meantime, Walter had hired a lawyer and arranged to sue Rachel. When we went to Rachel's room with the lawyer, she looked shocked at first, but then began to scream in anger. "Do you even realize what you're doing? Is it so wrong for a young person to clean the garden? Getting heat stroke was your own fault." Honestly, it's tough to sue without direct evidence of what happened before Cynthia collapsed, the lawyer said, "but we have the call history from Cynthia's phone requesting an ambulance." After that time, we saw Mom with Cynthia's phone, not to mention Cynthia's blood in Mom's car. We plan to pursue these points in the lawsuit. Shocked by Walter's cold words, Rachel broke down crying, hurling insults at me. "Say whatever you want, but be prepared for additional compensation for slander or defamation," I said firmly, leaving Rachel crying helplessly. We left the rest to the lawyer and moved to our new apartment, enjoying a peaceful life just for the two of us. 3 months later, Rachel called. No one had provided Rachel with a mobile during her hospital stay, so I had forgotten to block her number. Seeing Walter nod, I hesitantly answered the call. "Why is nobody home? This is your house, right? Come back home with your son. Theo and I have injured our legs. We need someone to take care of us. Even someone as dumb as you should understand that it's a wife's duty to care for her in-laws, right?" Just as Walter was about to yell, we heard Rachel laughing over the phone. "And return the money I lent you quickly. Complaining about compensation after borrowing from your parents. I never understand what goes through the mind of a stupid woman. I'll have to properly educate you again on that rotten mindset." Even though I took a few seconds to absorb Rachel's words, I still had no idea what she was saying. From what Rachel continued to say, it seemed that she thought the compensation she paid me was money she lent me. Confused by Rachel's words, Walter grabbed the phone. "The only one with a rotten mind and attitude here is Mom. We want nothing to do with you anymore. Don't ever come back. Don't ever meet us again. Look up the meaning of compensation in a dictionary. Stay out of our lives forever," he yelled before hanging up and immediately blocking her number. Walter even deleted Rachel's contact information. Although we had settled with Rachel through compensation, I decided to report her actions to the police. It turned out Rachel was already being sued by the owner of the rice field. My fall had disrupted the rice planting, significantly affecting the harvest, and damaged the pump used to manage water in the field. The owner was furious. Rachel, having paid me compensation, was nearly broke and unable to repay her debts. That's why she demanded the money back from me, but it was no longer my concern. I had visited the owner with a fruit basket as an apology, but they laughed it off, saying the person who pushed me was to blame. Eventually, Rachel had to take out a loan to pay a settlement to the owner and was working hard to repay it. Rachel was also facing divorce from Theo and had been kicked out of her home. She never changed her view of me as the one who took her precious son away. It seemed Rachel couldn't stand the sight of Theo and me getting along well. She mercilessly tasked me with chores while Theo was hospitalized, trying to teach me a lesson about who held the upper hand. As a result, her actions almost led to manslaughter, causing even Theo to disown her. After the division of property, Theo sold the family home and moved. Rachel, left without a home, now struggles through her days in a terrible state. She is still looking for Theo, but she will never find him because he is now living with us. We're staying together until Theo decides on his next place without letting Rachel know, of course. Theo has safely been discharged from a hospital and has improved enough to go for daily walks as part of his rehabilitation. His everyday activities have slowed down a bit, but he doesn't require live-in care. So we've chosen to stay close and watch over him. Theo and I continue to have a great relationship, and for a change of scenery, we often go on trips or dine out together on our days off.